There are stories that make us pause, stories that stop the world for a moment and force us to look beyond the surface, stories that remind us that behind every face, tired, wrinkled, hardened, hopeful, there is a life full of battles no one else has seen. And today's story is exactly that kind of story. It begins quietly, with an elderly man stepping into a courtroom, shuffling forward with the weight of years pressing on his shoulders. But what unfolds next leaves an entire courtroom stunned, a veteran revealed, a secret uncovered, and a legendary judge brought to the edge of tears. Welcome back to Swift Tale, the place where powerful moments become unforgettable narratives. And if you're visiting this channel for the very first time, I have one simple question for you. Have you liked, shared, and subscribed yet? If not, go ahead, because you won't want to miss what follows. Before we dive into this extraordinary moment, let me set the stage. The courtroom of Judge Frank Caprio is unlike any other. It's known around the world not just because of the judge's fairness, but because of his humanity, his humor, and his ability to see past the charges placed before him and look directly into the soul of the person standing across the room. Every day, people walk into that courtroom carrying burdens of all kinds, financial struggles, personal hardships, mistakes they regret, and situations they never imagined facing. But on this particular day, something different walked in, something heavy, something fragile, something powerful, an 84-year-old homeless veteran. He came in wearing clothes that seemed older than some of the people waiting in the back benches. His coat was thin, frayed at the seams. His shoes had traveled far more miles than they were ever designed to. His hands trembled not from fear, but from exhaustion. Yet even so, his posture held a faint trace of dignity, like a flag that refuses to fall, even after years of relentless storms. No one knew his name yet. No one knew his story. To most of the courtroom, he was simply another case on the docket, another citation to be processed, another formality. But as he stepped forward, even before he spoke, there was something different about him, an aura of history, of battles fought, of memories locked away in silence. What makes this story matter? Why does this moment stand out among thousands of courtroom cases, countless charges, and years of recorded interactions? Because this isn't just about a man with unpaid fines. This isn't about a judge giving someone a break. This is about what happens when the truth, long hidden by humility and hardship, rises to the surface and demands to be seen. It is about the shocking revelation of who this man truly is, the sacrifices he made, and the unbearable burdens he carried without asking anyone for help. It is about a society that often walks past its heroes without recognizing them. And it is about the life-changing ripple effect that unfolds when compassion meets truth. As Judge Caprio calls the veteran forward, you can almost feel the room shift. The judge, known for his gentle approach, looks at the elderly man with a mix of curiosity and concern. The charges appear simple, minor violations, overdue fines, citations that seem trivial compared to the man's age and condition. But the moment the judge begins asking questions, the facade starts to crack. The veteran hesitates, choosing his words carefully, as though every sentence carries a weight he isn't sure he is ready to release. The judge leans forward, sensing that the story beneath the surface isn't just deep, it is monumental. And then, slowly, the truth begins to unravel. The man isn't just homeless, he isn't just elderly, he isn't just facing financial hardship. He is a veteran, a man who once served this nation, who once stood strong in defense of others, who once risked everything so that millions could live in safety. Yet here he is, standing in a courtroom alone, unnoticed and unseen. He tries to downplay his past, brushing off the sacrifices he made as if they were nothing more than memories collecting dust. But Judge Caprio, perceptive and compassionate as always, knows there is far more to the story. And the more he asks, the more the courtroom begins to realize they are not merely in the presence of a defendant, they are standing before a quiet hero. And this is only the beginning. In the next moments, an unexpected revelation shatters the room's silence, and the judge himself, a man who has heard thousands of stories of hardship, finds himself speechless. The veteran's secret, kept hidden for decades, finally breaks free. It is a truth so powerful that it transforms the entire atmosphere of the courtroom, a truth that forces everyone present to reevaluate their assumptions about the man standing before them. a truth that challenges the very idea of justice, compassion, and humanity. This introduction, this opening moment, is the doorway to everything that follows. It is a reminder that you never truly know who stands before you. It is a lesson in humility, in gratitude, in looking beyond appearances to see the battles people carry in silence. And as the story unfolds, you will see why millions around the world were deeply moved by this moment, why the video spread across social media, why veterans communities rallied, and why Judge Caprio himself called it one of the most unforgettable cases he had ever witnessed. So stay with me, because this story is about to dive deeper into the life of a man who has endured more than most can imagine. It is about the pain he carries, the strength he hides, and the secret that ultimately brings an entire courtroom to tears. And as we go through this journey, remember, every person has a story. Every life has unseen chapters. Every face holds a history that can change everything once it's revealed. And before we continue, if you haven't already, make sure you like, share, and subscribe to Swift Tale. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful stories like this one to light, stories that remind us of the humanity we share, the voices we must amplify, and the compassion that must never fade. The journey begins now. The morning sun filtered through the narrow courthouse windows, casting angled beams of light that fell across the polished floor like a spotlight preparing a stage. The courtroom of Judge Frank Caprio had always carried a unique energy, part justice, part humanity, part theater. People from all walks of life sat scattered on the hard wooden benches, some nervous, some impatient, some quietly hopeful that today might bring them a moment of understanding rather than judgment. The gentle buzz of murmurs filled the air, a soft chorus of whispered conversations about parking tickets, overdue fines, and life's unexpected hurdles. Court staff moved efficiently, shuffling papers, checking schedules, and preparing for what they assumed would be a typical docket. But beneath the routine rhythm of the room, a subtle tension lingered, as if the walls themselves sensed that the day ahead would be far from ordinary. Judge Caprio, known for his steady calm and warm presence, entered the courtroom with the familiar mix of authority and compassion that had made him beloved around the world. His black robe swayed gently as he walked to the bench, his posture straight yet relaxed, his face carrying the softness of someone who had spent a lifetime listening to people's stories rather than simply judging their mistakes. He greeted the room with a small nod and that unmistakable half-smile that always suggested genuine interest rather than forced ceremony. For most people who came before him, this courtroom was a place of anxiety, but Judge Caprio had a way of transforming it into something else entirely, a place where truth mattered more than technicalities, where life circumstances carried weight, and where humility was met with compassion rather than ridicule. As the proceedings began, the atmosphere settled into its usual tempo. People approached the bench one by one to explain overlooked tickets, missed court dates, and misunderstandings that had turned into expensive fines. Some were embarrassed, some irritated, and some tried to lighten their nerves with awkward jokes. Judge Caprio interacted with each of them with a mixture of patience and humor, asking questions that made the courtroom chuckle and providing gentle reassurance to those who clearly needed it. For the staff, it was just another morning. For the audience, it was an environment where nervous anticipation occasionally gave way to unexpected laughter. But still, beneath the small waves of amusement and routine, something felt different. The air carried a heaviness that had no source yet, like a calm before an emotional storm. Behind all the movement and chatter, the door at the back of the courtroom creaked open, but hardly anyone noticed. An elderly figure stepped inside quietly, almost unnoticed, his presence swallowed by the room's restless energy. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, his body leaning forward slightly as if pushing through an invisible wind. He found an empty bench near the back and sat down with a soft, tired exhale, his eyes taking in the courtroom not with fear, but with the weary acceptance of someone who has stood in many rooms like this before, rooms where decisions are made by people who may never understand the silent battles he carries. Though no one knew it yet, this 84-year-old man would soon reshape the entire atmosphere of the courtroom. But for now, everyone else continued with their lives, unaware of the quiet storm sitting just a few feet behind them. Occasionally, Judge Caprio glanced at the far benches as people waited for their names to be called. His gaze often lingered for a second longer when he saw someone who appeared vulnerable, someone who might need more kindness than rules. It wasn't judgment, it was intuition, the kind that comes from decades spent listening rather than assuming. But even he couldn't have predicted what was about to unfold when the elderly veteran's name finally appeared on his screen. The courtroom clerk shuffled through her papers, reading names aloud. People rose and approached the bench one at a time. Some sighed with relief once they were done, others walked away wiping their eyes, overwhelmed by emotions they hadn't expected to release in a public space. Meanwhile, the old man waited silently, his frail hands clasped together. He did not shift or fidget. He simply sat quietly, eyes lowered, lost in thoughts that no one could see. If anyone had taken a closer look, they might have noticed the deep lines on his face, etched not just by age, but by pain, sacrifice, and memories too heavy to share. The courtroom atmosphere slowly shifted. The once lively murmurs softened. People began to sense that the energy had changed, though they couldn't quite place why. Even the staff seemed to feel it, a subtle drop in temperature, a quiet whisper of significance hanging in the air. It was as if the room itself had paused to take a breath. Judge Caprio continued working through the docket, but every so often he glanced toward the back again, this time noticing the elderly man's stillness. Something in the judge's expression changed, just slightly, but enough to show that he sensed there was more to this upcoming case than a simple fine or overlooked ticket. And then, finally, the moment arrived. The clerk called the veteran's name. It echoed through the courtroom with a weight that no one understood yet. A few heads turned. Some people sat up straighter. The judge leaned forward slightly, as if preparing for something he could feel but not explain. The elderly man rose with difficulty, gripping the bench for support before slowly making his way down the narrow aisle. The room felt unusually quiet as he walked, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps because some instinct deep within every person recognized that this man had lived a life far larger than his weary figure suggested. He reached the front and stood before the judge's bench. Judge Caprio looked at him not with authority, but with concern, curiosity, and compassion. This wasn't the typical start of a courtroom exchange. Something unspoken passed between them in that first silent moment, a recognition, a sense that this encounter would be different from all the others that had come before it. And the atmosphere of the courtroom, once busy and predictable, now held its breath. The real story was about to begin. As the elderly man reached the front of the courtroom, the weight of every eye in the room seemed to rest on him. Yet he walked with no sense of entitlement, no expectation of sympathy, only the quiet resignation of someone who had survived far greater trials than a courtroom appearance. His steps were slow, unsteady, but dignified. His clothing hung loosely on his thin frame, the kind of wear that suggested months, if not years, of hardship. His coat was faded and threadbare, and his shoes, scuffed, peeling, and nearly coming apart at the seams, had clearly walked through more than just weather. His face, deeply lined and carved by time, told stories that no words ever could. There was strength in those lines, but also loss, so much loss that even the strongest hearts might falter under its weight. As he finally reached the podium, he stood still for a moment, gripping its edge to steady himself. Judge Caprio watched him carefully, studying not just his appearance but the quiet aura that surrounded him. It was an aura of humility, of someone who had given far more to the world than he had ever taken. There was a silence in the man's eyes, a silence that felt like years of swallowed pain and unspoken memories. Even before he spoke, something about him commanded respect. Not the kind demanded by authority or status, but the kind that life itself grants to those who have endured more than most people can imagine. "Sir, good morning," Judge Caprio said gently, his tone softening instantly. This wasn't the tone he used for routine cases or minor violations. This was the voice he reserved for those whom life had treated with particular cruelty. The judge sensed it almost immediately. This man's story was not ordinary. The elderly man responded with a small nod. "Morning, Your Honor," he said in a voice that was raspy, thin, and cracked with age. His words carried the shaky tremble of someone who had spent many nights in the cold, someone whose throat was worn from time and hardship. Yet beneath the frailty, His voice held a firmness that hinted at the soldier he once was, a man shaped by discipline and silent resilience. Judge Caprio glanced at the papers in front of him. The charges were simple, a series of minor violations, mostly stemming from parking citations and overdue fines. Nothing about the paperwork reflected the gravity of the man standing before him. The system had reduced him to numbers and lines typed onto a form, but the judge knew, just by looking at him, that numbers could never explain this man's life. "What brings you in today?" the judge asked gently, though he already suspected that the answer would be tangled in hardship. The veteran hesitated. His eyes drifted downward, not out of guilt but out of weariness. "Just some tickets, Your Honor," he murmured, almost apologetically, as though he felt guilty for taking up the court's time. He shifted his weight, one hand bracing himself against the podium, as if holding himself upright required a quiet, constant struggle. Judge Caprio nodded, skimming the file again. "I see a few citations here," he said softly, choosing his words with care. "But before we get into that, could you tell me a little bit about yourself?" His voice held no pressure, only invitation. The kind of question that said, "I want to understand you, not judge you." The courtroom remained unusually still. People who moments ago had been whispering or exchanging restless glances now sat completely silent, drawn in by the quiet gravity surrounding the elderly man. The staff paused their work. Even the sounds of shuffling papers seemed to stop. It was as though the entire room had instinctively recognized that what this man was about to say would not be ordinary. The veteran swallowed hard, as if trying to decide how much of himself he was willing to reveal. "There's not much to tell," he said at first, his voice almost disappearing into the stillness, but the judge didn't look away. He waited, patient, compassionate, encouraging. After a long pause, the man finally lifted his eyes. "I served," he said quietly, two simple words, spoken without pride, without ceremony, without expectation, but those words carried the weight of an entire lifetime. "You served," Judge Caprio repeated gently, prompting him to continue. "Yes, Your Honor," the man replied. "Army." His voice wavered slightly, as though the memories it carried were too heavy to speak aloud. A ripple of emotion passed through the courtroom. People sat up straighter. A few exchanged glances. The judge's expression softened even more, and he leaned forward slightly. "How long did you serve?" 22 years, the veteran answered. He didn't say it boastfully. He said it like someone stating a fact from another lifetime, a lifetime buried under years of struggle and silent suffering. The judge blinked slowly, the number sinking in. 22 years was not a casual stretch. It was a lifetime of dedication, sacrifice, and service, a lifetime that often came with invisible scars. "What did you do after you retired from the service?" the judge asked softly. The man let out a long, tired breath. "I tried working different jobs. Things were okay for a while, but," his voice trailed off, the sentence swallowed by memories he didn't want to relive in front of strangers. He shook his head slightly. "Life got hard." The judge didn't push further. He didn't need to. Anyone with compassion could read between the lines. Anyone with eyes could see that this was a man who had lived through hardships that had slowly chipped away at everything he once had: family, home, stability, health. A man who had sacrificed so much for others, only to be left standing alone in the twilight of his life. The veteran's posture, though frail, still carried a faint shadow of the soldier he had once been. His hands trembled slightly as he rested them on the podium, but the grip was firm, steadfast, determined. Even in silence, his presence spoke of wars fought, friends lost, promises kept, and battles that never truly ended. The courtroom was silent, utterly silent, as everyone took in the reality of the man standing before them. This wasn't just another case. This wasn't just another defendant. This was someone who had once worn the uniform of his country, someone who had stood in the line of duty long before anyone else in that room ever faced their own struggles. Judge Caprio took a deep breath. He knew, everyone knew, that this case was about to become far more emotional than anyone expected. And the veteran, standing with the quiet dignity of a man who had endured more than life should ever demand, waited calmly for whatever would come next. Long before he stood in Judge Caprio's courtroom, Long before life had worn his body thin and carved deep rivers of pain across his face, the man was someone very different. His life had begun like so many others, simple, ordinary, full of dreams that felt big enough to touch. Born in a small working-class town, he grew up surrounded by fields, steel mills, and the familiar hum of neighbors who all knew each other by name. His childhood was far from easy, but it was marked by a sense of community that made even the hardest days feel survivable. He learned responsibility young. He learned discipline even earlier. And more than anything, he learned what it meant to stand up for others, even when no one stood up for him. By the time he reached adulthood, the world had changed around him. Conflict overseas was rising, political tensions were high, and countless young men were being called upon to serve their country. For many, the decision was difficult. For him, it was instinctive. He didn't enlist for glory, recognition, or medals. He enlisted because he believed in duty, because the values he had grown up with were built on sacrifice, honor, and the belief that freedom was something worth fighting for. He was barely more than a boy when he raised his right hand and took the oath that would shape the rest of his life. The transformation from small-town youth to disciplined soldier was swift and unforgiving. Basic training pushed him to his limits, forcing him to discover strength he didn't know he possessed. He learned how to survive, how to protect, and how to trust his brothers-in-arms with his life. The bonds he formed during those early months would last decades, long after the battles ended and the uniforms were folded away. Those men weren't just friends, they were family forged through hardship, sweat, fear, and unbreakable loyalty. As the years went on, he distinguished himself as a dependable and resilient soldier. He served during turbulent eras, stationed at bases across the country and around the world. He saw deserts, jungles, and foreign cities scarred by conflict. He witnessed the cruelty of war not through headlines or stories, but through the stark reality of comrades lost in combat, civilians displaced, and moments of terror that would replay in his mind for decades. Yet he also witnessed bravery, kindness, unity, and resilience in the most unexpected places. Through every deployment, he carried a quiet determination, never boastful, never seeking praise, simply committed to doing what needed to be done. His service earned him several commendations, though he rarely spoke of them. To him, medals were symbols, not of heroism, but of survival. Some were given for missions completed under impossible circumstances. Others were awarded for stepping in when someone else couldn't, and some represented the kind of sacrifice that could never truly be expressed in metal and ribbon. Each medal held a story he kept locked away, not because he was ashamed, but because he believed the world would never truly understand. After more than 2 decades in uniform, 22 long, grueling, honorable years, he retired from the military. Many people imagine retirement as the beginning of peace, a time to enjoy life and rest from decades of labor. But for veterans like him, the transition back to civilian life was anything but peaceful. He returned home to a world that no longer resembled the one he had left. The faces were different. The jobs were scarce. The support systems for veterans, especially those wrestling with the emotional aftermath of service, were lacking, fractured, or non-existent. He tried to rebuild. He worked odd jobs at first: security guard, mechanic's assistant, warehouse hand. He woke up early, worked late, and pushed himself long after his body began showing signs of wear. But the shadows of his service followed him. Nights were the hardest. Sleep rarely came, and when it did, it was often interrupted by memories that felt too real to escape. The nightmares were silent battles he fought alone, battles that no one else could see. Over time, they took their toll. Despite the challenges, he remained proud. He never once asked for pity. He never blamed anyone for the struggles he faced. When health issues began to surface, aches that never went away, tremors that worsened with cold weather, the slow decline of a body that had endured too much, he simply pushed through. He told himself he had been through worse, and in many ways he had. But the truth was far more painful. His service had cost him more than he ever admitted. As the years passed, life slowly unraveled around him. The job opportunities grew fewer, the medical expenses increased, friends moved away, families drifted apart, and the support he once had faded into memory. Isolation crept in like an unwelcome guest, and before long, he found himself standing at the edge of a reality he had never imagined: homelessness. Not because he was careless, not because he gave up, but because the world often moves on without recognizing the invisible wounds its protectors carry. He lost his apartment after missing too many payments. He tried to survive on what little savings he had left, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, he found himself living out of his vehicle, parking wherever he could find safety, moving constantly to avoid attention. The same vehicle that once gave him shelter would later become the reason for the citations that brought him to Judge Caprio's courtroom. Each ticket was a reminder of how far he'd fallen, yet even then, he never complained. He never cursed the world, he simply kept going. Through all of this, he carried one thing with him, a secret from his years of service, something he had never revealed to anyone after he retired, something so profound that even Judge Caprio would find himself speechless when he heard it. It was a truth he had held close to his heart for decades, buried beneath layers of humility, silence, and pain. And now, standing in a courtroom years later, facing minor citations that did not even begin to reflect the magnitude of his life, that secret was about to come to light. Homelessness is never a single event. It is a slow unraveling, a quiet erosion of stability that happens thread by thread, until one day a person wakes up and realizes there is nothing left to hold on to. For the veteran standing in Judge Caprio's courtroom, the journey from decorated serviceman to a man living out of his vehicle was not the result of laziness or irresponsibility. It was the result of hidden battles, battles that began long before the citations, long before the sleepless nights in parking lots, long before strangers looked at him and saw only an old man instead of the soldier he once was. After leaving the military, he carried with him wounds that no one could see. Some were physical, joint pain from years of carrying heavy packs, a back injury from an explosion that had thrown him to the ground, and hearing loss that worsened slowly over time. But the deeper wounds were invisible, etched into his mind like scars that never truly healed. Nightmares crept into his sleep like shadows that refused to disappear. Flashbacks interrupted quiet moments without warning. Loud noises made his heart race, crowds made him uneasy, and certain memories he tried so desperately to bury, clung to him with relentless force. He tried to seek help at first, visiting clinics, speaking to counselors, filling out forms, sitting through long waiting room hours. But resources were limited, support was inconsistent, and the system was overwhelmed with thousands of veterans just like him, each carrying their own silent war. Over time, he grew tired of explaining himself to people who could hardly understand. He grew tired of retelling the same painful stories. He grew tired of waiting for appointments that never seemed to arrive. Eventually, he simply stopped trying. It wasn't that he didn't want help, it was that asking for it became another battle he no longer had the strength to fight. The emotional toll followed him to work. Jobs that once seemed manageable became harder. Concentration slipped. Fatigue weighed him down. His body, worn from years of service, began to betray him. Tasks that younger men completed with ease became nearly impossible for him to finish without pain. And as the years passed, employers grew less patient. Performance reviews declined. Hours were cut. And eventually, he found himself on the wrong side of layoffs he never saw coming. With every setback, his savings dwindled. He sold old possessions, furniture, appliances, anything with value to pay for rent, utilities, and basic needs. He told himself it was temporary, that he would find another job, that things would get better. But time kept moving forward, and opportunities kept slipping through his fingers. The world does not slow down for struggling veterans, it rarely even notices them. The moment he lost his apartment, he felt something inside him break. It wasn't just the loss of a place to sleep, it was the loss of stability, of safety, of dignity. He packed what little he could into his agging vehicle, a car that shook whenever he turned the engine, a car that was barely held together by rust and hope. That car became his closet, his bed, his shelter from the cold. Nights grew longer, winters grew harsher, the loneliness deepened. Parking became a daily challenge. He moved constantly from street to street, trying to avoid drawing attention. Sometimes he parked in grocery store lots, hoping security wouldn't tap on his window. Sometimes he parked near parks, where other homeless individuals gathered for safety. And other nights, he found himself on quiet back streets, praying that no one would bother him. That very vehicle, his last remaining piece of stability, would later become the reason for the citations that dragged him into the courtroom. Each ticket left under his windshield wiper felt like a reminder that society had forgotten him. He wasn't trying to break the law. He wasn't trying to evade responsibility. He was simply trying to survive. But survival isn't simple, not when the world sees you as an inconvenience instead of a human being. Yet even in his struggle, he never begged. He never asked strangers for money. He never held a cardboard sign or approached passing cars for help. Pride can be a fragile thing, but his was woven from decades of discipline and dignity. He refused to let the world see him as anything less than the soldier he once was. Even in his most desperate moments, he stood tall, quietly, humbly, invisibly. People passed him every day without knowing who he was. They saw only the exterior, the worn clothes, the tired face, the unkempt appear. They never saw the soldier underneath, the man who once stood strong in the face of danger, who once protected strangers with unwavering courage, who once served a nation that now walked past him without a second glance. But through all his hardship, through every cold night and every empty morning, he held on to one thing, a secret he had protected his entire adult life, a secret that, despite all the hardship, he refused to reveal until now. And as he stood in Judge Caprio's courtroom, quietly battling shame, exhaustion, and the remnants of a life filled with sacrifice, that secret finally was about to come to light. The courtroom felt impossibly quiet, so quiet that even the shuffle of papers or the creak of a chair seemed loud enough to echo. The veteran stood before Judge Caprio, his hands clasped together, his posture slightly hunched from years of physical pain and emotional weight. He hadn't intended to reveal anything personal. He had planned to answer the judge's questions plainly, pay whatever fines he could, and leave without drawing attention to himself. But something about the way Judge Caprio looked at him, patient, gentle, genuinely concerned, caused a long-closed door inside him to shift. For the first time in years, someone wasn't rushing him or judging him. Someone was simply asking him to speak. Judge Caprio started with soft questions: where he had been living, why his vehicle had so many citations, whether he had family he could rely on. The veteran hesitated each time, choosing his words carefully, trying not to sound pathetic or weak. He explained that he was living out of his car, that he had no stable income, that he was doing his best. But as he spoke, his voice began to falter. He could feel the truth rising in his chest, pressing against him like a weight that demanded release. For years he had hidden his service record, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he didn't want sympathy. He didn't want people to look at him and see a broken soldier. He didn't want discounts, acknowledgments, or pity. All he had ever wanted was a quiet, simple life after the chaos of war. But now, standing in that courtroom, he realized something. Remaining silent was costing him more than his pride. It was costing him his chance to be understood. His throat tightened, his hands trembled, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he told the judge the truth. "I'm a veteran, United States Army. I served overseas for nearly 20 years. The words hung in the air like a confession, fragile yet powerful. The courtroom shifted. Even those sitting in the back, people who moments earlier had been scrolling through their phones or whispering to one another, lifted their heads. Judge Caprio leaned forward, surprise softening into compassion. The veteran continued, each sentence heavier than the last. He spoke about the battles he had fought, not the ones with guns and explosions, but the battles with silence, with trauma, with a system that seemed to forget the very people it had once sent into harm's way. He explained how his declining health made it difficult to work, how his savings ran dry, how he had been living in his car for months. He admitted the shame he carried, how he avoided telling anyone about his service, because he didn't want people to think he was using it to gain anything. For the first time in a long time, he let himself be vulnerable. His voice cracked as he described waking up in the cold, alone, hoping no one would knock on his window. He spoke of feeling invisible, forgotten, discarded by the nation he had once proudly served. The courtroom remained silent, not out of indifference, but out of respect. Every word he shared carved a deeper truth into the room. Judge Caprio's expression changed. His eyes softened with empathy, his posture shifted, and the judge who moments ago was reviewing a routine parking citation was now face-to-face with a man carrying decades of pain. The veteran's secret had reshaped the entire moment. Suddenly, this wasn't about parking tickets. It wasn't about city ordinances or fines. It was about a man who had given everything he had to protect others and received almost nothing in return. As the veteran finished speaking, he lowered his eyes, bracing himself for judgment. He expected disappointment, maybe even frustration. But instead, Judge Caprio let out a gentle breath, the kind that precedes a compassionate decision. The room felt warmer somehow, as if the truth had lifted a veil no one realized had been there. For the first time in years, the veteran felt seen, not as a burden, not as someone who failed, but as someone who had endured more than most could imagine. And in that fragile, vulnerable moment, something shifted inside him, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this time someone would stand on his side. The courtroom air seemed to thicken as the veteran's quiet confession settled into the walls. It wasn't the full truth, not yet, but it was the first time he had revealed even a fragment of it in years. Judge Caprio watched him closely, sensing there was more beneath the surface. The judge had seen countless people come through his courtroom, people who lied, people who hid the truth, and people who were simply trying to survive. But this man, something about him felt different. There was a weight in his voice that came from years of carrying burdens no one should bear alone. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, his tone gentle but clear. "Sir, when you say you served for nearly 20 years, what exactly do you mean? Where did you serve?" His question wasn't interrogative. It was an invitation, an offer to speak freely, maybe for the first time in decades. The veteran swallowed hard. His eyes drifted downward as if replaying memories he had tried desperately to bury. He hesitated, struggling internally. Revealing the next part wasn't just difficult, it was painful. The memories weren't heroic in his mind, they were haunting. They were tied to things he had seen, decisions he had made, people he had lost. He had built walls around those experiences, and those walls had kept him upright all these years. Now they were cracking. I was deployed in several operations," he finally murmured, his voice trembling. "Some of them were classified, some of them I don't like to talk about." A ripple of curiosity moved through the courtroom, even the bailiff. A man known for his stoic expression lifted his eyebrows slightly. Something significant was emerging, something far beyond an average military service story. Judge Caprio nodded with understanding, not pressure. "You only need to share what you're comfortable with," he assured, "but I want you to know you're safe here." Safe, that word alone hit the veteran harder than anyone realized. He hadn't felt safe, not truly, in decades. Not after the last mission that changed his life. Not after returning home to a country that had no place for him. Not after losing the people he loved. Safety had become a distant memory. And yet, here, in this small courtroom in Providence, he felt something he hadn't expected: permission to breathe. He lifted his gaze slowly, meeting the judge's eyes for the first time without fear. "Judge, I wasn't just a soldier," he said, voice breaking. "I was part of a unit that, well, let's just say we were sent places no one wanted to be. We were the ones who went in first and left last. We lost good men, too many." His words wavered, and so did his composure. He gripped the edges of the podium to steady himself, his knuckles turning white. The courtroom was silent, so silent it felt reverent. This wasn't a legal proceeding anymore. It was a confession booth, a safe harbor, a moment of truth long overdue. He continued, slower now, each word weighed with grief. "When I came home, people expected me to just go back to normal. But you don't go back, you can't, not after what you've seen." His eyes glistened. "I tried, I really tried." Judge Caprio's features softened even further. He had confronted heartbreak before, but something about this man, this tired, weathered 84-year-old veteran, stirred something deeper in him: compassion, respect, sorrow. Seeing that empathy, the veteran's guard cracked further. The next word slipped out, unplanned but undeniable. "There's more, Judge, a lot more, things I never told anyone." His voice dipped into a whisper. "I didn't want people to look at me differently because of what I did and what it cost me." A murmur spread faintly among the spectators. They could sense that the veteran wasn't just a homeless man with parking tickets. He wasn't a forgotten senior or a struggling drifter. He was someone who carried a story, a secret that could shift the entire room once revealed. And though he hadn't yet uncovered the deepest part of his truth, everyone present could feel it coming. The emotional tension tightened, drawing every eye to the man whose life had suddenly become the center of the room. Judge Caprio spoke softly, "Take your time, we're listening." For the first time in years, the veteran felt heard. And with that, the door to the truth began to open wider, revealing that the real story was far more powerful than anyone expected. The veteran stood trembling at the podium, his breath shallow, his eyes distant as though he was staring at ghosts only he could see. His earlier words had already silenced the courtroom, but now there was something heavier, an unspoken tension that clung to every inch of the room. Everyone sensed that what he was about to reveal wasn't just personal, it was life-changing. It was devastating. It was the kind of truth a man carries only when the weight of it becomes unbearable. Judge Caprio leaned forward, hands folded gently on the bench. His tone was earnest, almost fatherly. "Sir, whatever you need to say, you can say it here. You're among people who respect you, I promise you that." The veteran swallowed hard, his throat tight from years of silence. He lifted his shaking hands slightly, then let them fall to his sides, as if releasing a burden that had been strangling him. For a moment, he closed his eyes. When he opened them, they glistened with tears he had refused to allow for decades. "Judge, I wasn't just a soldier, I wasn't just a member of a unit." His voice cracked. "I was part of a classified rescue team. We were the ones sent to retrieve prisoners, downed pilots, civilians trapped behind enemy lines. We were ghosts. No badges, no names, no recognition. If we succeeded, no one knew. If we failed," he paused, the air tightening around him, "no one ever found out." A ripple ran through the courtroom, shock, awe, disbelief. Even the stenographer paused her typing. "My last mission," he continued, "was the one that ended everything for me." His voice trembled, but he forced himself on. "We were sent in to rescue a group of hostages. Children, Judge, just kids. They were trapped in a compound deep in enemy territory. We were outnumbered, cut off, no backup. I didn't think we'd make it out." He drew a shaky breath, gripping the podium as memories surged. "One of the boys got separated during the chaos. I went back for him. My team yelled at me not to, but I couldn't leave him." His voice wavered, heavy with emotion. "I found him hiding behind a broken wall, crying. He couldn't have been more than 6. The courtroom was frozen, breathless. "We were spotted," he said, voice cracking again. "I grabbed him, shielded him, took the hit meant for him." He tapped his chest, as if touching scars hidden beneath his worn-out coat. "That bullet should have killed me." He closed his eyes briefly, steadying himself. "But we got the boy out, every single one of them, alive." A few spectators gasped quietly. One woman covered her mouth with her hand. A man in the back blinked away tears. The veteran continued, his tone hollow and pained. "But the mission was classified. No medals, no ceremony, no recognition. When I came home, no one even knew I existed. I couldn't tell anyone what happened. I couldn't explain why I couldn't sleep, why the nightmares came every night, why I couldn't keep a regular job." His hands shook harder. "I lost my wife. She couldn't understand why I was different. My daughter stopped calling. And when my savings ran out and my body started giving out, I didn't have anyone to turn to." His voice dropped to a whisper so fragile it barely reached the judge. "So I lived in my car, alone, forgotten, and I told myself I deserved it." He bowed his head, tears finally falling. "I saved lives, Judge, but somewhere along the way I lost my own." The silence that followed was thick enough to suffocate. No one moved. No one even breathed loudly. Judge Caprio's eyes softened with deep, unmistakable sorrow, mixed with profound respect. "You carried that alone?" the judge asked quietly, voice filled with compassion. "For almost 40 years, the veteran replied. The room erupted, not in noise, not in words, but in emotion. You could feel the collective heartbreak. Every person in that courtroom knew they had just witnessed the confession of a man who had given far more than he ever received. The truth wasn't just powerful, it was devastating. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, visibly shaken. He had presided over thousands of cases. heard countless stories, witnessed unimaginable struggles, but never had a revelation struck him like this. The courtroom wasn't just stunned, it was transformed. The veteran's secret had destroyed the walls of shame around him and laid bare the extraordinary courage he had carried alone. For a long moment, Judge Caprio couldn't speak. He sat motionless, hands clasped tightly together, his eyes locked on the trembling 84-year-old veteran before him. The courtroom had fallen into a reverent silence, the kind that only exists when everyone present knows they've just witnessed something extraordinary. The judge had listened to thousands of stories during his decades on the bench, stories of hardship, tragedy, mistakes, and redemption. But this was different. This was a confession drenched in sacrifice, soaked in pain, and wrapped in a lifetime of unspoken heroism. And it shook him to his core. Judge Caprio finally drew in a slow breath, visibly wrestling with the wave of emotion rising inside him. His usual calm, soft-spoken demeanor remained, but there was a noticeable tremor, a crack in his voice that revealed how deeply the veteran's story had pierced him. The judge hated seeing anyone suffer, especially someone who had already given so much. But this, an invisible hero living out of his car, carrying wounds no one had bothered to ask about. It was almost too much for him to bear. "Sir," he began, his voice unsteady. He paused, blinking away the sting in his eyes. "What you've shared today, what you've lived through, is beyond anything I can truly understand. You stood for this country with courage most people cannot fathom. And yet here you are, standing before me alone, burdened and struggling, when you should have been honored and supported." The veteran lowered his gaze, ashamed, but Judge Caprio would not allow it. "No," the judge continued firmly, his voice strengthening. "Look at me." Slowly, the veteran lifted his head. Their eyes met, one filled with years of quiet suffering, the other with raw compassion. "You are a hero," Judge Caprio said, the words heavy, sincere, and absolute. "A hero who was forgotten by the very people who should have stood beside you." A visible tremble rippled through the veteran's shoulders. He was not used to being seen, truly seen. The judge straightened, his tone shifting from emotional to resolute. "As for these fines, let me be very clear." He leaned forward, pausing long enough for the room to hold its breath. "You will not pay a single penny." A soft gasp circulated around the courtroom. Judge Caprio continued, "You have paid more than enough in your lifetime. These parking violations, these citations, they are nothing compared to the sacrifices you've made. They are dismissed, all of them." The veteran's lips parted, stunned. A tear slid down his cheek, followed by another. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him. His entire body quivered with a mixture of relief and disbelief. For decades, he had felt invisible, expendable, forgotten. And now, in the middle of a small municipal courtroom, a judge was giving him something he had not felt in years: dignity. But Judge Caprio wasn't done. "Sir," he continued gently, "it should never have come to this. You should not be living in your car. You should not be walking into court alone. And you should not have had to carry your story in silence." He turned slightly toward the court staff. "We're going to help him, immediately." The room stirred, court officers nodding, clerks wiping their eyes, spectators whispering their amazement. Judge Caprio looked back at the veteran. "I'm going to personally contact the local Veterans Affairs office. We're going to arrange proper housing for you, medical care, financial assistance, everything you deserve. And if they don't move quickly enough," he paused, lowering his voice into a rare, powerful seriousness, "they will answer to me." The courtroom almost erupted with emotion. The veteran covered his face with both hands, overwhelmed. His shoulders shook as decades of loneliness, shame, and grief collapsed under the weight of compassion he never expected to receive. Judge Caprio allowed him time to breathe, then spoke softly. "You gave your strength to this country. Now it's time for this country, and for all of us, to take care of you." A hush fell across the room, one filled not with silence, but with respect. People weren't just watching a courtroom case anymore. They were witnessing a moment of humanity, a moment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Finally, the judge offered the veteran the warmest smile, a smile filled with reassurance. "You are not alone anymore," he said. "Not today, not ever again." And with that, the gavel fell, not as a symbol of punishment or procedure, but as a promise of compassion, justice, and hope. The moment Judge Caprio's gavel touched the bench, the courtroom transformed in a way no one could have anticipated. It wasn't the loud kind of transformation, not shouting, not applause, not chaos. Instead, it was a deep, emotional shift that swept across the room like a warm tide. It was as if every heart in that space had simultaneously cracked open, revealing compassion that had been dormant or forgotten. People looked at the veteran differently now, not as a stranger, not as another case number, but as a man who had lived through unimaginable sacrifice, a man who had given everything and received almost nothing in return. Respect radiated from the courtroom seats, a silent tribute that carried more meaning than words ever could. Some spectators wiped tears from their eyes, stunned by the gravity of what they had heard. Others bowed their heads, humbled by the realization that they had just witnessed a moment they would never forget. The bailiff, usually stoic and unshakable, stood motionless, his jaw tight with emotion he wasn't used to showing. Even the court clerk, who had typed thousands of mundane hearings into the record, paused with trembling hands. The air felt sacred, as though the walls themselves were honoring the veteran's courage. As the veteran stepped back from the podium, he looked smaller than before, tired, frail, yet somehow more dignified. He moved slowly, unsure of where to go or what to do, overwhelmed by the kindness he had just received. A woman in the audience instinctively rose to her feet, offering him a gentle nod of support. Another man placed a hand over his heart, silently saluting him. People who moments earlier had been absorbed in their own lives now saw him as a symbol of strength, sacrifice, and endurance. Their faces carried a unified expression, gratitude. Judge Caprio watched the scene unfold with quiet reverence. He had seen emotional cases before, cases that tugged at his heart, but this one had touched something deeper. This wasn't just justice. This was humanity, and it reminded everyone in the room why compassion mattered. Why listening mattered, why people like this veteran should never be forgotten. Gradually, the energy in the courtroom shifted from sorrow to solidarity. Conversations erupted in hushed tones, people discussing ways to help, asking court officers what they could do, whispering about community shelters, donations, and veteran services. It was as though the judge's decision had ignited a collective responsibility among the onlookers. Strangers became allies in a shared mission to make sure this man would never be invisible again. The veteran, still stunned, lifted his eyes and slowly scanned the room. What he saw made his lips quiver. Every pair of eyes looking back at him held warmth, compassion, and deep respect. He wasn't being judged. He wasn't being pitied. He was being honored. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a burden. He felt like a human being, one who mattered. As he stepped away from the podium, a court officer gently approached him, not with authority, but with kindness. He whispered that Judge Caprio wanted to speak with him privately after the session. The veteran nodded, his emotions too tangled to express in words. He felt something he thought he had lost forever, hope. When the next case was called, the courtroom was no longer the same. The atmosphere hadn't returned to ordinary procedures or mundane frustrations. Instead, a quiet reverence lingered, a reminder that one man's truth had reshaped everyone's perspective. The courtroom wasn't just a place of law today, it had become a place of humanity, compassion, connection, and healing. And as the veteran sat down quietly in the back of the room, people around him subtly moved their chairs closer, not to crowd him, but to make sure he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was no longer alone. The moment the veteran stepped out of the courthouse, the world outside seemed different, brighter, warmer, more alive than the cold, indifferent streets he had grown accustomed to. But it wasn't just the sunlight that changed. The people did. Word of what happened inside Judge Caprio's courtroom spread faster than anyone expected. It began with a few murmurs among those who had been present, then conversations in the courthouse halls, and by the time the veteran reached the steps, it had become a ripple turning into a wave. A small crowd had gathered outside, some waiting intentionally, others drawn by curiosity after hearing fragments of the emotional testimony. They didn't come to judge him, they came to thank him. A young woman approached first, hesitating as she held out a warm cup of coffee. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you for your service," she said softly, her voice trembling with sincerity. The veteran blinked in surprise, touched by a gesture he hadn't experienced in years. Before he could respond, another person stepped forward, an older man wearing a veteran's cap. Without a word, he reached out and pulled the elderly veteran into a gentle embrace, the kind only another soldier could understand. Others followed, offering handshakes, nods, and respectful salutes. The veteran, overwhelmed, felt tears forming again, not from pain this time, but from the sudden flood of human kindness. By the end of the day, the story had reached local news stations. Reporters began calling the courthouse, requesting interviews with Judge Caprio, wanting to know more about the homeless veteran whose truth had moved an entire courtroom to silence. The headline alone captured hearts. Homeless 84-year-old veteran's hidden heroism leaves judge in tears. Social media lit up like wildfire, posts, photos, and emotional reactions spread rapidly. Thousands of people commented, expressing outrage that a man who served so bravely had been allowed to fall through the cracks of society. Messages poured in from citizens across the city and even across the country, offering donations, housing assistance, or simply words of gratitude. Within hours, local veterans organizations mobilized. Leaders from shelters, support programs, and medical centers contacted the courthouse directly. One group arranged for temporary housing that same evening, insisting the veteran should never again have to sleep in his car. Another organization offered medical evaluations, counseling services, and transportation. A retired doctor volunteered to personally oversee the veteran's care. Offers of help multiplied faster than anyone could process. The community didn't stop there. A well-known local restaurant announced it would provide daily meals for the veteran, no questions asked. A nearby barbershop offered free grooming services. A clothing store volunteered to provide new clothes suitable for winter. Strangers, people who had never met the veteran, sent warm blankets, handwritten letters, gift cards, and items they hoped would bring him comfort. For the first time in decades, the veteran wasn't invisible. He wasn't forgotten. He was remembered, appreciated, and embraced. Meanwhile, Judge Caprio remained deeply involved behind the scenes. He personally spoke to officials at the Department of Veterans Affairs, pushing for expedited benefits, proper housing placement, and long-term support. His emotional commitment inspired bureaucratic officers to move faster than usual, each representative recognizing the significance of this moment. The judge's advocacy became a driving force that ensured the veteran wouldn't be lost in a stack of paperwork ever again. As the days passed, something even more remarkable happened. The veteran's story inspired a movement. Local community groups organized a fundraiser to support homeless veterans, raising thousands of dollars in a matter of hours. Volunteers formed teams to find and assist other aging veterans living on the streets. Awareness campaigns launched across social media, urging people to look beyond appearances, to see the stories hidden behind tired eyes and weathered faces. Schools invited veterans to speak to students. Churches held candlelight vigils in honor of those who served in silence. And through it all, the veteran watched in quiet amazement. For years, he had felt abandoned and overlooked. But now, every act of kindness reminded him that compassion still existed in the world, that humanity, when awakened, could be unbelievably powerful. Strangers had become supporters. Supporters had become advocates. And a once-forgotten hero had become a symbol of strength, resilience, and the impact of simply being heard. For the first time in a long time, the veteran felt something he thought he had lost forever: belonging. As the courtroom absorbed the emotional weight of Frank's confession and the judge's growing empathy, the hearing moved into a quieter, but deeply revealing phase. This was when Judge Caprio began asking questions not about the ticket, not about the day Frank was cited, but about the years leading up to this moment. And it was in this gentle, measured conversation that another layer of Frank's life unfolded, one that no one expected, and one that carried a powerful message about resilience, sacrifice, and the quiet struggles so many veterans face long after their service ends. Judge Caprio leaned forward and asked Frank how long he had been living without stable housing, and Frank answered in a low, steady voice, "A little over 12 years. He didn't say it as though he wanted pity. He spoke as though he was simply stating a fact, like the weather, like the time of day. But the room reacted instantly. There was a shift in the energy, a sharp awareness that this was no ordinary case, no ordinary man. Frank explained that homelessness had crept into his life slowly. It wasn't one catastrophic event. It was a series of losses, setbacks, and sacrifices that gradually pushed him to the margins. After returning from service, he tried to rebuild his life, working odd jobs, supporting his family, and doing whatever he could just to keep moving forward. He talked about how injuries he sustained during his years in the military made it harder for him to maintain steady work, and how the lack of proper medical treatment gradually eroded both his health and his opportunities. And then he admitted something even harder. He had been estranged from most of his family for years, not because he didn't care about them, but because he didn't want them to see how difficult life had become for him. That moment hit the courtroom like a silent explosion. You could feel it. A man who had once risked everything for his country now carried the weight of the world alone, not wanting to burden anyone else, not even the people who loved him. Judge Caprio, who had heard thousands of cases, looked genuinely shaken. His voice softened as he asked Frank where he slept at night. Frank told him that he rotated between shelters, abandoned buildings, and public benches when he had no other choice. But what startled everyone most was the fact that, even after everything he had gone through, poverty, illness, loneliness, Frank still volunteered at a local veterans center whenever he could. He helped other former service members find food, find transportation, find hope. They need someone, he said quietly, and I know what it's like when you don't have anyone. The courtroom sat in absolute silence. Imagine that, a man with almost nothing still giving everything he had to others who were struggling. Judge Caprio asked Frank why he had never reached out for government support, VA resources, or disability benefits. Frank replied with something heartbreaking, I didn't think I deserved it. He went on to explain how many veterans he had met who were in far worse condition, far more injured, far more broken. He didn't feel right asking for help when there were others he saw suffering more. This was the kind of humility that both inspires and devastates you at the same time. For Judge Caprio, it was a turning point. You could see it in his face, a look that mixed disbelief, admiration, and sadness. It wasn't just the story of hardship that moved him. It was the quiet dignity with which Frank carried that hardship, without complaint, without anger, without resentment. Frank then revealed a final detail, one that tied the entire narrative together and stunned the courtroom even further. The reason he had been out on the street the night he received the ticket wasn't because he was careless or irresponsible. He had been walking miles across the city trying to deliver a backpack full of essentials, blankets, food, socks, to another homeless veteran he knew was struggling. The man had recently been robbed and had nothing left. So Frank used what little resources he had scraped together from collecting cans and doing small labor jobs to help someone else survive the cold night. That was his crime. That was why he was out after hours. That was why he ended up in Judge Caprio's courtroom. Every person in the room felt their breath catch. This wasn't just a veteran. This wasn't just a homeless man. This was a hero living quietly in the shadows, doing more good with his nearly empty pockets than some people do with overflowing ones. Judge Caprio slowly leaned back, visibly affected. The courtroom cameras captured the moment, a judge struggling to hold back his emotions, stunned not by defiance, but by overwhelming compassion and integrity. He wasn't looking at a defendant anymore. He was looking at a man who embodied service in its purest form. And in that moment, Section 12 paints the emotional climax, the judge, the audience, and the entire courtroom beginning to understand the full truth behind Frank's life. It wasn't just about a homeless veteran revealing his struggles. It was about the revelation of a selfless heart, a man who gave more than he ever received, a man who proved that even in the harshest circumstances, dignity and kindness can survive. The courtroom was still settling from the emotional weight of Frank's revelations when Judge Caprio leaned forward again, his voice low, steady, and filled with a kind of reverence rarely heard in a courtroom. Section 13 begins with this powerful shift. The judge was no longer asking routine questions or reviewing simple details. He was speaking to Frank as a man, not a defendant. He started by acknowledging the courage it took for Frank to share his story so openly, especially after so many years of carrying the burden alone. The tone in the room transformed as Judge Caprio began dissecting the deeper meaning of everything Frank had said. This wasn't just a situation about a missed court date or a small violation. This was a broader reflection on the failings of a system that had left a veteran, someone who had once sworn to protect the nation, abandoned by the very country he once served. The judge then shifted the focus to something unexpected and deeply impactful. He told Frank that the courtroom had witnessed something rare, something that spoke louder than any legal argument ever could. He pointed out that Frank's entire life story demonstrated a level of humility, sacrifice, and moral clarity that was, frankly, astonishing. "You've been serving long after your service ended," he said. The words echoed across the silent room. You could see how Frank's eyes widened slightly, surprised that anyone would recognize the small acts he did in the dark corners of the city, acts he had never expected praise for. This wasn't flattery. It was truth, spoken with conviction by a judge known for his empathy and fairness. Then came a moment that left the courtroom stunned once again. Judge Caprio said that he believed Frank's actions were not merely admirable, they were heroic. He reminded the audience that heroism isn't always loud or public. Sometimes it's quiet, consistent, and almost invisible. Helping other veterans despite being homeless himself, volunteering with no resources, carrying kindness when he had almost nothing left. That was heroism. But the judge didn't stop there. He went on to address the larger failure at play, men like you should never be forgotten by their country. His tone was firm, almost painful, as he acknowledged the injustice of Frank's situation. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just observing a case, they were witnessing a moral reckoning. Then Judge Caprio did something that demonstrated just how deeply he had been moved. He began to explore solutions. He asked Frank if he would allow the court, along with community outreach programs, veteran organizations, and local support groups, to help him get back on his feet. Frank hesitated, clearly unused to receiving help, but after a long pause, he nodded. It wasn't just acceptance. It was the first time in a long time that someone had offered him support without judgment, without strings attached, and without making him feel like a burden. That single nod sent a wave of relief through the room. Judge Caprio then addressed the courtroom audience directly, speaking not just as a judge, but as a citizen, a human being, and a compassionate leader. He explained that Frank's situation was a reflection of thousands of veterans who walk among us every day, unseen, unheard, and unsupported. It was a powerful call to awareness. He reminded everyone that the freedoms enjoyed today were built on the backs of people like Frank, and yet too many of them fell through the cracks once their service was over. Finally, the judge delivered a statement that would soon go viral, shared across social media platforms as a message of accountability and humanity. If a society's greatness is measured by how it treats its most vulnerable, then today we have been reminded of just how much work there is left to do. The room was silent, not because people didn't know what to say, but because everyone felt the truth of those words. Frank, seated quietly at the defense table, looked as though he weren't sure how to process the respect he was receiving. After years of invisibility, he wasn't just being seen, he was being honored. Section 13 closes on a subtle but powerful moment. Frank, for the first time in years, seemed to sit a little taller, not because his circumstances had magically changed, but because he finally felt recognized, not as a homeless man, not as a burden on society, but as a veteran, a hero, and a human being worthy of dignity. And with Judge Caprio's promise of assistance, the stage was set for the final resolve of the case, one that would shock everyone in the next section. As the courtroom settled into an emotional stillness, every eye rested on Judge Caprio, waiting to see how he would resolve a case that had become so much more than a simple violation. Section 14 marks the turning point where compassion meets justice, where the judge's verdict becomes a message not just to Frank, but to the entire world watching. Judge Caprio took a long pause, his hands folded, his expression thoughtful. It was clear he wanted his decision to reflect the truth of what had just unfolded, not the cold letter of the law, but the warmth of the humanity behind it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who understood that moments like this could change lives. The judge began by acknowledging the seriousness of Frank's situation and the years of hardship he had endured. He emphasized that the ticket was irrelevant compared to the deeper failure represented by a nation allowing one of its veterans to slip through society's cracks. "This courtroom," he said softly, cannot fix the world, but today we can do right by one man." The crowd leaned in closer. Everyone sensed something extraordinary was coming. Judge Caprio then announced that he would be dismissing Frank's case entirely, not just waiving the fine, not postponing the ticket, but fully erasing every penalty attached to it. But he didn't stop there. He said he was doing so not out of pity, but out of respect. Respect for Frank's service, respect for his character, and respect for the selfless acts he continued to perform despite having so little himself. The room erupted in soft murmurs of approval, but the judge held up his hand gently. He wasn't finished. He told Frank that the court wanted to support him, not just in words, but in meaningful, practical ways. Judge Caprio explained that he had already contacted a local veterans assistance organization before returning to the bench, sharing Frank's situation with them. They had agreed to step in immediately to provide housing support, medical evaluations, employment resources, and ongoing counseling. Frank blinked in disbelief, unable to speak as the judge continued. This was not just a dismissal. It was a lifeline, one Frank never expected to receive. "Your service to this country didn't end when you left the military," Judge Caprio said. "Your kindness, your sacrifices, your effort to help others, even when you were struggling yourself, prove that you are the kind of man any community should be proud to support." The cameras captured Frank's reaction vividly. His shoulders trembled slightly, his eyes shining with tears he tried to control. For a moment, he looked like a man suspended between gratitude and disbelief, as though he feared waking up from a dream too good to be true. Then came the moment that would define this hearing for millions of viewers. Judge Caprio opened the Courtroom's donation program, a fund often used to help people in need, and announced that he would personally contribute to ensure that Frank had immediate access to essentials like clothing, food, and transportation. His contribution prompted others in the courtroom to stand and voluntarily offer donations as well. One by one, people approached the clerk's desk, lawyers, spectators, even court staff, each adding to the growing fund. Frank watched, stunned, as the community he never expected to care about him rose to support him. The judge then spoke directly to Frank, offering him words that would stay with him forever. "You are not alone anymore. You have people who see you, who value you, and who want to help you reclaim your life." It wasn't just a verdict. It was a restoration of dignity, a declaration that Frank mattered, that his sacrifices meant something, and that his life was worth rebuilding. For the first time in over a decade, Frank allowed himself to smile, a small, hesitant smile, but one filled with hope. Section 14 concludes with a powerful image, Frank slowly rising from his seat, shaking the judge's hand with a mixture of gratitude and humility. The courtroom erupted in applause, not loud, chaotic applause, but the kind that comes from deep admiration and heartfelt respect. The applause of human beings recognizing the humanity in one man's struggle. This moment would go on to inspire millions around the world, becoming one of the most emotional and widely shared clips in Judge Caprio's history. It marked the beginning of a new chapter for Frank, a chapter filled with possibility, support, and the dignity he had been denied for far too long. As the courtroom doors slowly closed behind Frank and the echoes of applause faded, Section 15 brings everything together, what this moment meant for Frank, for the courtroom, and for everyone watching around the world. The story of an 84-year-old homeless veteran walked in as a defendant, but he walked out as something far more powerful, a reminder of the strength, dignity, and quiet heroism that often go unseen in the people society overlooks. Judge Caprio's decision didn't just dismiss a case, it restored a man's hope, rekindled his sense of worth, and reminded millions that compassion has the power to change a life in a single moment. This final chapter reflects on that transformation, on how one act of kindness can ripple outward into something larger than anyone expected. Frank's journey reminds us that behind every face we pass on the street, behind every person struggling in silence, there is a story we may never fully understand. It shows how quickly we make assumptions, how easily we overlook people who have sacrificed more than we can imagine. And as Judge Caprio demonstrated, empathy doesn't require grand gestures or perfect systems. Sometimes it requires simply listening, caring, and choosing humanity over cold procedure. This case became a symbol of what justice looks like when infused with compassion, a reminder that no one is too lost, too forgotten, or too broken to find their way back when someone extends a hand. And now, as we close this story on Swift Tale, I want to speak directly to you, the viewers. Stories like this matter because they reveal the truth about our world. Kindness still exists, hope can still rise from hardship, and one moment of understanding can create a lifetime of change. If this story moved you, inspired you, or opened your eyes to the unseen struggles of veterans like Frank, then let's keep this message alive. Let's be the kind of people who notice those who are overlooked, who reach out when others look away, and who choose compassion even when it requires effort. Thank you so much for watching. If this is your first time visiting Swifttail, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And don't forget to comment below what part of Frank's story impacted you the most. Your voice matters, your thoughts matter, and together we can keep sharing stories that bring light, truth, and humanity into the world.